Hello and welcome to Media7. I'm Russell Brown. What began as the news of the world phone hacking scandal has turned out to be about far more than a newspaper illegally accessing thousands of private voicemails. Successive revelations in Britain have placed Rupert Murdoch and his company at the centre of a story of police and official corruption, cover-ups and the pervasive culture of political influence. And thanks to the Leveson inquiry into the press, the story marches on. Jose Barbosa catches us up.
Like a sale at Briscoe's, the ongoing Leveson inquiry has become an ever-present fact of life, humming away in the background like it's always been there. And what it's found has been so damning, raincoat sales have ballooned from all the spit takes it's induced. You'll recall that News Corp was mad keen on acquiring the multi-billion-dollar chunk of satellite broadcaster B-Sky B it doesn't already own. That was eventually scuppered after an outcry over revelations News of the World journalists had accessed the voicemail of murdered teenager Millie Dowler. The bloke set up to adjudicate the bid while it was still alive was the Culture Secretary Jeremy Hunt. Last month, while James Murdoch was giving evidence at the Leveson inquiry, it was revealed Adam Smith, Hunt's advisor, had been passing on inside intelligence to News Corp.
Emails now released reveal that Mr Murdoch was told by his advisor that he'd managed to get some info, although absolutely illegal, about what Jeremy Hunt would say to Parliament the next day. Another claim that the minister believed we would get there at the end, and he shared our objectives.
And so everyone got stuck in.
While his Culture Secretary remains in place, while he refuses to come clean on his and the Chancellor's meetings with Rupert Murdoch, the shadow of sleaze will hang over this government.
That is the inquiry I have set up. Whether it is the proper regulation of the press, whether it is cleaning up our financial system, whether it's dealing with our debts, I don't duck my responsibilities. What a pity he can't live up to his.
Adam Smith resigned almost immediately, but the stink still remains. Also beavering away was the Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee. They concluded that they had been directly misled by some core Murdoch players, including Les Hinton, former executive chairman at News International, seen here wearing a digital necktie of shame.
We've been led up the garden path by News International. 2 years ago, in our report, we found the organisation guilty of collective amnesia and said it was inconceivable that one rogue reporter was involved, and we were right.
The report went further, much further.
We conclude, therefore, that Rupert Murdoch is not a fit person to exercise the stewardship of a major international company.
Although some of the MPs on the committee thought it was a conclusion they shouldn't make.
It is Ofcom that makes fit and proper tests and not select committees. So in a way we've lost our chance to produce a unified, credible report where we would all have agreed.
What exactly did Rupert know about the phone hacking? He claims that knowledge of the grubby practice, among others, was actively kept from him.
There's no question in my mind that maybe even the editor, but certainly beyond that, someone took charge of a cover-up, which we were victim to, and I regret.
What has also emerged are more questions about Murdoch's relationship with successive governments. Lest it be forgotten, the godparent of one of his daughters is none other than Tony Blair. So nearly everyone in the cage is becoming well and truly smeared. And maybe even the public shouldn't be spared a speck or two of muck.
They went out there and bought the News of the World year in, year out. They wanted to put their money up for Help for Heroes or whatever kind of pedo-bashing campaign it was, but at exactly the same time they were engaged in a kind of titillation and a kind of unveiling. You know, it's Oscar Wilde, you know, the native land of the hypocrite.
Now, before he returned to New Zealand in 1994, Brian Gould was a senior member of the British Labour Party's shadow cabinet. His colleagues, Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, subsequently attained and maintained power through famous accommodations with the Murdoch press. I went to Whakatane this week to find out what the now retired Gould makes of the scandal and how he understood the importance of the Murdoch media when he was an MP.
I was one of those, I think, who spoke out and warned about the danger of a very powerful Murdoch media empire. And as far as I knew, most of the rest of the Labour Party agreed with me, but sadly, they didn't maintain that position for very long.
And Tony Blair, of course, became close friends with Murdoch eventually. But was there a point, do you think, where he made the decision that he needed the pact with Murdoch? He needed to cross the line and do that?
Oh, I've no doubt that Tony Blair saw a deal with Rupert Murdoch, and initially it was just a deal. It became a friendship later. But I think he saw the deal as an essential step towards winning power. I think the only question really is how early that happened. My own view, for what it's worth, is that the beginnings were there and apparent long before Tony actually became leader of the Labour Party. In my few last months, perhaps year or two, I noticed what favourable references there were to Tony in the Times, Sunday Times and so on. And of course, once he became leader, he worked very hard, I think, to cement that relationship. And when he in due course won the 1997 election, I think this put the seal on the belief, which then became absolutely rock solid right across the political class, that you had to do a deal and be on good terms with Rupert Murdoch, and particularly the Sun newspaper, if you wanted to win a general election. I personally never took that view because I thought that the British electorate was very keen to get rid of the Tories almost as soon as they woke up on the morning after the 1992 election, with John Major re-elected, and I think they thought to themselves then, my God, what have we done? We must get rid of this lot at the first opportunity.
If politicians like Blair were seeking the good opinion of the Murdoch papers, what was Murdoch looking for in return? What was the quid pro quo?
I think he wanted, in essence, access to government. And that's still true of Murdoch and his acolytes. The evidence is overwhelming that even to this very day, with the new Conservative government in power, that Murdoch and his major supporters, his chief executives and so on, and News International, are texting and communicating with ministers on a daily basis, meeting with them on a weekly basis at the very least. So what he wanted, I think, was access with a view always to deflecting any undue attention to what he was getting up to, and to having himself and his interests waved through if there was any step that was required. And we see today the Culture Secretary in the present government, Jeremy Hunt, in real trouble. He was supposed to take a quasi-judicial view of whether Murdoch should be permitted to take over the parts of Sky B he didn't yet own. And yet, while he was supposed to be acting virtually like a judge, impartially, he was communicating, so it seems, through his office with Murdoch, or the James Murdoch, the younger Murdoch, frequently, and being briefed on what the cabinet was saying and deciding.
And it appears that we know that because News International released that information to try and damage Hunt.
Yes. And that's another characteristic, of course, of the Murdoch mode of operation. If you cross them, they set out to punish you. And there are many, many instances of people in Britain, at any rate, in public life, and I suspect elsewhere as well, because that's the other aspect of the Murdoch operation, just its sheer breadth. 800 companies in 50 different countries worth $5 billion. And in all of those instances, if you cross Murdoch, he will use the power of his media outlets to punish you.
Is it that global scale that makes Murdoch different? Because Britain has always had its prime ministers and press barons going back to Northcliffe and Beaverbrook, hasn't it? Is it that global reach that makes Murdoch different?
I think so. I don't think we've seen, until today, the sheer spread of media interests in one set of hands. And that, I think, is particularly powerful because it is cross-media. There was a time, 15 years ago, say, when it was regarded as, in principle, dangerous to allow one person to own interests in the press and powerful interests in television and so on, all at the same time. Yet that's what Murdoch has done. And he's different as well, I think, in that he's very overtly prepared to use that power. No one's in any doubt about this. Murdoch currently, of course, disowns the famous Sun headline in 1987, I think it may well have been, which was on the morning after the general election, which Mrs. Thatcher had won. It was the Sun what won it. It may have been 92, I'm not sure. He now says, no, that was a mistake. But that was the truth of the matter. And of course, he benefited from people believing that he could control politics and politicians in that way. So that's what makes him different. I think earlier examples of press barons were regarded as powerful, and it was probably a good idea if you could to keep on side with them, but they didn't hold your fortunes entirely in their hands, as it was believed, at any rate, that Rupert Murdoch does. And that, I think, for both Labour and Conservative politicians in Britain, has been the case. Of course, in other countries, and particularly in America, the influence is used in a different way, I think. Not to make or break politicians so much as to swing public opinion through Fox News and so on, to try and create a climate of opinion which the politicians of the day have to take into account. Here is a man who holds views that, on the whole, I think, would be rejected by a very large majority of ordinary voters, and yet his views prevail to a huge extent. Certainly in British politics. It was said by my old colleague John Prescott, who was then the Deputy Prime Minister, that Rupert Murdoch was the 19th member of the Cabinet. He was present in spirit, as it were, in every Cabinet meeting. And John Prescott said he was the 19th, but not the least powerful.
And yet we've still seen David Cameron's Conservative Party effectively decide to stay with Murdoch in what is almost an abusive relationship. Why are they doing that?
In the run-up to the 2010 general election, David Cameron made it his business to do and to signal to Rupert Murdoch that he would do exactly what Murdoch wanted. So he promised that Ofcom, which is the regulatory body for the media, would be emasculated, have its powers virtually removed. One aspect that we haven't yet mentioned was the huge Murdoch assault on the BBC. He can't abide the BBC because it's so powerful and it represents a different model of broadcasting from the one that he favours. But David Cameron signalled that he would stop the increased funding for the BBC. And it's only, I think, since the general election, and now that David Cameron's in government, and indeed until very, very recently, until the phone hacking scandal broke and began to embroil government ministers and the police and so on, it's only then that David Cameron has realised the dangers that he's been running. But it's too late now, I think. And I think the damage is done. Both Murdoch and Cameron are now trying to disengage from each other, but I think the lid has been lifted a bit. A little corner of the cover has been lifted, and the ordinary voter in the electorate can see exactly how close, how incestuous almost, that relationship has been.
Former British Labour MP Brian Gould. An extended version of that interview with some interesting commentary on Sky TV's place in our media market is available on the Media7 website. After the break, the meaning of Murdoch for newspapers.